The sky over Guizhou that day looked as if it had been torn apart. Thick, heavy clouds, swollen with moisture, twisted together like colossal boulders hanging over the villagers' heads. No one knew that within just a few hours, the entire regions of Rongjiang and Laysan would be wiped off the map by a nightmare come true. It began with a few raindrops tapping on the rooftops, the sound on the corrugated metal roofs almost comforting. But in the blink of an eye, the heavens seemed to dump an entire ocean onto the land. Water poured down from the mountains, merging with a massive torrent released from the world's largest dam, turning every creek and river into a raging, unstoppable flood. The roar of the water shook the ground like thousands of wild buffalo charging into the village. Streets once alive with the calls of vendors and children's laughter became furious rivers, sweeping away everything in their path: cars, motorbikes, furniture, even small houses. Residents had no time to understand what was happening before the water was already at their waists, then quickly over their knees, lashing against their bodies like whips. There was no time to gather belongings, no chance to lock the doors, only pure survival instincts remained. Mothers clutched their children tightly, trembling, scrambling to climb onto rooftops or anything that might float. Elderly men were swept away in the swirling currents, their hands reaching out in desperation. Power poles toppled, blue sparks bursting before being smothered by the muddy water. Shouts for help blended with the roar of the flood, forming a terrifying symphony no one would ever forget. In a narrow alley in Rongjiang, a car was swept away, spinning between the current, slamming into a wall before vanishing into a massive whirlpool. At a nearby school, classes had just let out, and students were about to head home when the flood crashed in, tearing down the fences, swallowing the playground, erasing the joyful shouts that had echoed just minutes earlier. This was no summer rainstorm, it was a calculated assault, cold and merciless, from both nature and human hands. In an instant, the familiar rhythm of life turned into an apocalyptic painting. Mud, trash, wooden planks, and household items spun in the current like dancers in a deadly waltz. No one knew when it would stop. And in the midst of the horror, a brutal truth flashed through everyone's minds. This wasn't just rain, it was a monster, born from both the fury of the earth and the negligence of mankind. The roar of the water seemed to tear through the very fabric of the air. It didn't just pound in the ears, it resonated in the chest, running down to the soles of the feet, making people feel as though the ground beneath them wanted to swallow everything whole. In downtown Rongjiang, narrow alleys just wide enough for two motorbikes to pass became water tunnels, churning violently, carrying with them the stench of mud, garbage, oil, and death. One witness, Xiao Tang Yuan, recalled in a trembling voice, she had just driven into an underground garage when the ground began to shake. Seconds later, muddy water surged in like a colossal wall, slamming against the walls with a crack that chilled her to the bone. She flung open her car door, struggled through the current, clinging to an air duct before climbing onto the roof of her car. By the time she stood there, the water was already at her shoulders. Her car, the only means of transportation she had for 6 years, vanished beneath the surface in minutes, leaving behind a cold emptiness and the certainty she would not survive. Not everyone was as lucky as she was. In a nearby neighborhood, a family of 3 was trapped in their one-story home. They climbed onto the roof, waving desperately for help, but the water rose too quickly. In a video that later spread online, viewers saw only the roof collapsing into the raging whirlpool. No one needed to say what the ending was, everyone knew. Among the chaos, the most haunting images were the stillness of death. Bodies floated, tangled in tree branches, hair covering faces, clothes torn apart. The flood carried away everyone, young or old, rich or poor. A convoy of cars was swept from the main road, spinning like toys in the hands of some invisible giant. Some cars still had people trapped inside, windows sealed tight by the pressure of the water, their weak pounding quickly swallowed by the deafening roar. Even symbols of hope weren't spared. The county's football stadium, once a source of pride that had put Rongjiang on the national sports map, was now submerged under 7 meters of water. The stands, the roof, the pitch, all gone. Only the bare white goalposts jutted above the murky water like the skeleton of a dead beast. On the rooftops that remained, people huddled together, their eyes wide with panic and despair. They didn't know if help was coming or if the flood would claim the last of what remained. Minutes dragged on, the wind howled louder, and rain whipped their skin raw. The cries for help grew weaker, replaced by a chilling silence, the kind that survivors would carry with them into their dreams, a ghost that would never leave. Even as the water raged outside, another wave, this one of fury, was rising inside the people. Authorities quickly declared this a once-in-50 years flood, blaming extreme rain and climate change. But those in Rongjiang and Laysan, those who had lost homes and loved ones, did not believe that was the whole truth. They pointed upstream, to the world's largest dam, which had just unleashed an enormous torrent without sufficient warning. Signs went up only when the water was already at the doors, and by the time the sirens wailed, it was too late. A former provincial judge, Lin Xiaolong, spoke bluntly, "The rain belongs to the sky, but this disaster belongs to man." He stressed that negligence, corruption, and lack of preparation had claimed more lives than nature itself. Many locals said they had heard rumors of an impending release from the dam 2 days earlier, but the official notice came only when the flood was already upon them. Flood control roads once promised, levees once drawn on blueprints, all remained only on paper. Meteorologists and water experts had long warned of black swan events, rare but catastrophic floods, that would become more frequent due to climate change. But in China, natural disasters often find an accomplice: outdated infrastructure and human negligence. In Rongjiang, the drainage system was decades old, underground pipes clogged with garbage and silt, and reservoirs operated for economic gain instead of public safety. After the disaster, Chinese social media exploded with burning questions. Why was the dam's water release not announced earlier? Why do billion-yuan flood control projects remain on paper? Who will be held accountable for the hundreds of lives and hundreds of thousands of homes lost? These weren't just questions, they were knives twisting into the silence of the officials. Some local leaders hurriedly held press conferences, reading long statements, but none answered the most important question: will next time be any different? For the people of Rongjiang and Laysan, their trust had been swept away along with their roofs, their memories, and the empty promises they'd been given. And more frightening than the flood itself was the feeling that, even when the skies cleared, they would still be left alone in a system that had never been ready to protect them. When the water finally receded, mud coated every corner, every step, every warped doorframe. Streets once bustling were now lined with sagging homes, crooked wooden beams, shattered glass scattered among debris and broken bricks. The laughter of children had been replaced by the scrape of shovels, heavy sighs, and sobs choked back in grief. More than 680,000 people were now homeless, crammed into makeshift tents on hillsides, spending each night listening to the wind and fearing the flood's return. In the shelters, mothers tried to shield their children from the cold and from insects. Children played with plastic bottles, bricks, and branches, substitutes for toys that had been carried away forever. An elderly teacher, Mei Lin, returned to her 2-bedroom home, standing silently before its damp walls, bookshelves caked in mud, her lifetime collection of journals now nothing more than pulp. She didn't dare step further inside, knowing each step would mean letting go of the past. On the once gentle river, school backpacks floated aimlessly among debris and splintered wood, an image that haunted the entire community. They were not just remnants of a flood, but symbols of stolen childhoods, disrupted education, and dreams drowned in mud. The people of Rongjiang and Laysan knew they were not merely victims of a violent flood. They were proof of a harsher truth: nature can be brutal, but human negligence and incompetence can make it far more deadly. Promises of reconstruction and billion-yuan flood defenses still echoed on television, but their faith had already sunk with the waters. The sky has cleared, the sun has returned, but in the eyes of the survivors, there still lingers a heavy gray cloud, one made of doubt, loss, and fear. Rongjiang's scars are not only on its water-stained walls but etched deep into the memories of its people. And that haunting will remain, until the day they finally hear a true answer to the question, will next time be any different?